the Leagues of Votann, children of the stone and stars, the forgotten kindred. In the grim darkness of the far future, where humanity's children have scattered across the galaxy in forms both familiar and alien, there exists a civilization that the Imperium has largely forgotten, or perhaps deliberately ignored. Deep in the galactic core, where ancient stars burn with the fury of creation itself, the Leagues of Votann have carved out an empire built not on faith or conquest, but on pragmatism, honor, and the wisdom of artificial minds older than the Imperium itself. These are not the Space Marines with their gene-forged perfection, nor the cowering masses of Imperial citizenry. These are the kin, squat, hardy, and ingenious descendants of humanity, who have thrived in the most hostile regions of the galaxy. They are miners who crack open worlds, warriors who face down the galaxy's horrors with grim determination, and keepers of technology that makes even the Adeptus Mechanicus weep with envy. But make no mistake, the Leagues of Votann are not merely space dwarfs with better guns. They represent something far more profound and terrifying to the established powers of the 41st millennium. They are proof that humanity can prosper without the Emperor's light, without the Imperium's crushing bureaucracy, and without the constant sacrifice of freedom for security. The Great Exodus, the origins of the Leagues of Votann, stretch back to the dark age of technology, that legendary period when humanity first reached for the stars with confidence rather than desperation. During this golden age of innovation and expansion, massive generation ships launched from Terra, carrying not just colonists, but entire civilizations in their holds. These vessels, equipped with standard template construct databases and artificial intelligences of staggering sophistication, were humanity's insurance policy against an uncertain future. The ships that would eventually seed the Leagues of Votann were different from those that established the worlds that would later become part of the imperial domain. These vessels were crewed by hardy folk, miners, engineers, void workers, and their families. People accustomed to hard labor in dangerous conditions, who valued practical skill over political maneuvering. When they chose their destination, they didn't seek the garden worlds or the easy pickings of the galaxy's spiral arms. Instead, they plunged deep into the galactic core, where ancient stars blazed with fierce intensity, and the very fabric of space-time writhed with energies that could either kill or transform. The Votann Awakening. What made these particular colony ships unique was their cargo of artificial intelligences, the Votann. These were not mere machine spirits or servitor brains, but true artificial minds of breathtaking complexity and capability. Each Votann was designed to be a repository of human knowledge, a guardian of technological wisdom, and a guide for the colonists in their new homes. As the generation ships delved deeper into the galactic core, something extraordinary happened. The intense stellar radiation, the exotic matter prevalent in the core systems, and perhaps something more esoteric began to affect the Votann. Rather than degrading their functions, these influences caused the artificial intelligences to grow, to evolve, to become something more than their creators had ever intended. The Votann began to dream. They dreamed of worlds carved from living rock, of forge complexes that could reshape matter at the molecular level, of children who would be born not weak and soft like their ancestors, but hardy and strong, adapted to thrive in the most hostile environments imaginable. These dreams became blueprints, and these blueprints became reality through the Votann's mastery of genetic manipulation and stellar engineering. The forging of the kin. The transformation of the original human colonists into what would become known as the kin was not a sudden mutation or chaotic twist of fate. It was a careful, deliberate process, guided by the Votann over thousands of years. Using their vast knowledge of genetics, biotechnology, and evolutionary biology, the Votann began subtle modifications to the human genome. The changes were practical above all else: increased bone density and muscle mass to handle high-gravity worlds and the crushing depths of asteroid mines, enhanced lungs and circulatory systems to process thin atmospheres and resist toxic gases, improved night vision for working in the eternal darkness of space. Most importantly, an extended lifespan that would allow the kin to accumulate the experience and wisdom necessary to master complex technologies and honor ancient traditions. But the Votann's greatest gift to their children was not physical, it was mental. The kin were born with an intuitive understanding of technology that bordered on the supernatural. They could diagnose a malfunctioning plasma reactor by the sound it made, repair a void suit with improvised materials that shouldn't work but somehow did, and coax performance from ancient machines that had been written off as irreparable. This wasn't mere genetic manipulation. The Votann had somehow encoded the accumulated wisdom of the dark age of technology directly into the DNA of their charges, creating a race of natural engineers and voidfarers who carried the knowledge of humanity's greatest achievements in their very cells, the Ironkin and the living ancestors. As the millennia passed and the kin spread throughout the galactic core, their civilization developed along lines that would be utterly alien to imperial sensibilities. Central to their culture was the concept of the clone family, or kindred. Rather than the chaotic lottery of natural reproduction, the kin perfected the art of genetic replication and modification. Each kindred was built around genetic templates of proven worth, legendary miners who could find rare minerals in barren asteroids, void pilots whose reflexes were so sharp they could thread a needle at light speed, warriors whose tactical genius had saved entire populations from extinction. These templates, refined over generations and enhanced with the best traits from other lineages, became the foundation stones of kin society. But the true masterpieces of this genetic artistry were the Ironkin, artificial beings that bridged the gap between the purely mechanical Votann and their living children. The Ironkin possessed synthetic bodies of incredible durability and sophistication, housing minds that were part programmed intelligence, part genetic heritage of the kin themselves. They served as intermediaries, translators who could speak both the binary cant of the Votann and the emotional language of living beings. To the kin, the Ironkin were not servants or tools, but honored members of the family. They were the living ancestors, beings who carried the memories and wisdom of the kindred across the centuries, who could remember the first days of colonization and the lessons learned from countless battles and hardships. The wisdom of the ancestors. This connection to their ancestors gave the kin something that the Imperium had long since lost: perspective. Where imperial citizens lived and died in ignorance of their past, the kin maintained an unbroken chain of memory stretching back to the dark age of technology itself. Every scientific breakthrough, every tactical innovation, every hard-won lesson was preserved not just in data cores, but in the living memory of beings who had witnessed these events firsthand. This ancestral wisdom manifested in ways both profound and practical. Kin engineers didn't just follow standard template construct patterns, they understood the principles behind them and could adapt designs to meet new challenges. Kin warriors didn't merely drill formations learned by rote. They studied the tactical genius of ancestors who had faced similar situations and improvised solutions that their enemies couldn't anticipate. Most importantly, The kin maintained their connection to the original vision of the Votann. They remembered that they were meant to be builders, not just survivors. Their purpose was not merely to endure in the darkness between the stars, but to create something better than what had come before. Forge worlds of the core. The heart of kin civilization lay not on planets, but in massive space-borne installations that dwarfed even imperial battle stations. These strongholds were marvels of engineering that combined the functions of fortress, factory, and city into structures that could house millions of kin and their ironkin companions. Each stronghold was built around a Votann core, the housing for one of the great artificial intelligences that guided kin civilization. These cores were massive constructions of exotic matter and crystallized thought, quantum computers so advanced that they could predict stellar evolution, calculate the trajectory of individual atoms through space, and simultaneously manage the needs of entire populations. The strongholds themselves were designed to be completely self-sufficient. Massive refineries processed raw materials harvested from asteroid belts and stellar coronas. Hydroponic gardens and protein synthesis plants produced food that was both nutritious and surprisingly palatable. Manufacturing complexes turned out everything from personal equipment to void ships using techniques that made imperial fabrication methods look primitive by comparison. But perhaps most impressive were the defensive systems. Each stronghold was armed with weapons that could crack planets or vaporize entire fleets. Their shields could withstand direct hits from nova cannons, and their hull plating was made from materials that simply didn't exist in the periodic table of standard imperial science. When a stronghold went to war, it didn't just deploy its defenders, it became a weapon of mass destruction in its own right. The mining guilds. The economic foundation of kin society rested on their unparalleled ability to extract resources from the most hostile environments in the galaxy. The galactic core was rich beyond imperial imagination. Rare elements created in the hearts of dying stars, exotic matter produced by black hole interactions, and crystallized energy formations that could power entire civilizations. The kin mining guilds were more than just industrial organizations. They were elite military units whose members were equally capable of fighting off Xenos raiders and extracting precious minerals from the molten core of a star. These void miners used technology that seemed magical to outsiders, gravitational manipulators that could reach into a star's heart and extract specific elements, matter disintegrators that could carve tunnels through solid diamond, and personal shielding that could protect a worker in the vacuum of space or the crushing depths of a gas giant's atmosphere. Each mining expedition was a carefully planned military operation. Scout ships would survey potential sites, analyzing stellar conditions, gravitational anomalies, and the likelihood of hostile encounters. Engineering teams would deploy the massive extraction equipment, while security forces established defensive perimeters. And when the work was done, the site would be restored to its natural state. The kin were pragmatic, but they were not wasteful or destructive. The wealth generated by these operations allowed the Leagues of Votann to maintain their independence and fund their advanced technology. They didn't need to trade with the Imperium or submit to its authority, because they controlled resources that made them completely self-sufficient. The Hernkin pioneers. At the edge of kin space, where the known territories faded into the unmapped darkness, rode the Hernkin pioneers. These were the scouts and pathfinders of kin civilization, mounted on anti-gravity bikes that could traverse any terrain and armed with weapons that could stop a charging Carnifex in its tracks. The Hernkin were drawn from the most adventurous and independent-minded of the kin kindreds. They lived for the thrill of discovery, the challenge of surviving in hostile environments, and the honor of expanding the boundaries of their people's knowledge. Each pioneer was a master of multiple disciplines: warrior, explorer, engineer, and diplomat all in one. Their anti-gravity bikes were marvels of kin technology, capable of atmospheric flight, void travel, and even limited teleportation through folded space. Equipped with advanced sensors and communication arrays, a single pioneer could survey entire star systems and relay detailed information back to the strongholds. When diplomacy was required, they served as ambassadors. When threats emerged, they became raiders and saboteurs. But the Hernkin served another, more subtle purpose. They were the canaries in the coal mine of galactic politics, the first to encounter new threats or opportunities. Their reports shaped the strategic decisions of the Votann and determined whether the Leagues would extend the hand of friendship or the fist of war to their neighbors. Ion Age Arsenal, the weapons and equipment of the kin, represented the pinnacle of human technological achievement, preserved and refined over 10,000 years of continuous development. While the Imperium struggled to maintain pale shadows of Dark Age technology, the kin had not merely preserved the original knowledge, they had improved upon it. Ion weapons were the signature armament of kin forces, projecting streams of charged particles that could melt through the heaviest armor or reduce organic targets to component atoms. Unlike the crude plasma weapons favored by the Imperium, kin ion technology was reliable, efficient, and could be modified on the fly to deal with different types of threats. Magna rail weapons used magnetic acceleration to fire projectiles at velocities approaching the speed of light. These weapons could punch through void ship hulls from thousands of kilometers away or reduce enemy fortifications to rubble with pinpoint precision. The ammunition was simple, ferrous slugs, but the technology that propelled them was so advanced that even the Adeptus Mechanicus couldn't replicate it. Personal equipment was equally impressive. Kin void suits provided better protection than Imperial power armor, while being lighter and more maneuverable. Their tools could reshape matter at the molecular level, allowing field repairs that would be impossible with Imperial technology. And their vehicles combined the best features of anti-gravity propulsion, plasma drives, and quantum teleportation systems to create transports that could operate in any environment, from the vacuum of space to the crushing depths of ocean trenches. The barrier technology. Perhaps the most envied aspect of kin technology was their mastery of barrier fields, energy shields that could protect everything from individual warriors to entire strongholds. These barriers didn't just deflect incoming attacks, they analyzed the energy patterns of weapons fire and adapted in real time to provide optimal protection. Against las weapons, the barriers would shift to reflect coherent light. Against plasma, they would create magnetic containment fields that redirected the superheated matter away from protected areas. Against solid projectiles, they would generate localized gravitational distortions that could slow or stop incoming rounds. The most advanced barrier systems could even protect against exotic attacks like psychic assaults or temporal weapons. They accomplished this by creating multidimensional shield matrices that operated across several layers of reality simultaneously. The mathematics involved were so complex that only the Votann themselves fully understood the principles involved. Quantum engineering. The true secret of kin technological supremacy lay in their mastery of quantum mechanics and dimensional engineering. They could manipulate matter and energy at the subatomic level, creating materials and devices that operated according to principles that seemed to violate the known laws of physics. Their manufacturing processes took place partially in pocket dimensions where the laws of thermodynamics worked differently, allowing them to create perpetual motion machines and energy sources that produced more power than they consumed. Their weapons could fire ammunition that didn't technically exist until the moment of impact, making them impossible to defend against using conventional means. Transportation systems used quantum tunneling to move instantly across vast distances without actually traveling through the intervening space. Communication networks operated through quantum entanglement, providing instantaneous contact across the entire galactic core, regardless of stellar interference or psychic storms. This technology was so advanced that it bordered on the supernatural, leading many Imperial observers who encountered it to assume that the kin were using some form of Xenos sorcery or chaos corruption. The truth was both more mundane and more terrifying. The kin had simply never forgotten how to properly use the technologies that humanity had developed during its golden age. Lost records and suppressed truth. For 10,000 years, the Imperium of Man had operated under the assumption that it represented the entirety of human civilization in the galaxy. Imperial scholars acknowledged that isolated human colonies might exist beyond their borders, but these were assumed to be primitive societies that had regressed to barbarism without the Emperor's guidance. The existence of the Leagues of Votann challenged this fundamental assumption in ways that the imperial hierarchy found deeply uncomfortable. Here was evidence that humanity could not only survive, but thrive without imperial rule. The kin maintained advanced technology, stable government, and peaceful relations with non-human species, all things that imperial doctrine claimed were impossible without the Emperor's direct intervention. Rather than acknowledge this contradiction, the Imperium chose willful ignorance. Records of early contact with kin expeditions were classified or destroyed. Reports from rogue traders who had encountered kin vessels were dismissed as fabrications or misidentifications. When pressed, imperial authorities would reluctantly admit that the squats had once existed as an abhuman species, but claimed they had been wiped out by tyrannid hive fleets centuries ago. This wasn't mere bureaucratic incompetence. It was a deliberate campaign of suppression orchestrated by the highest levels of imperial government. The existence of the Leagues of Votann represented an existential threat to imperial legitimacy. If humanity could prosper without the Emperor, without the ecclesiarchy, without the endless sacrifices demanded by the imperial war machine, then what justified the Imperium's existence? The squats that never were. The squat designation was itself a piece of imperial propaganda designed to diminish and marginalize the kin. By classifying them as abhumans rather than true humans, imperial doctrine could dismiss their achievements as the products of Xenos influence or genetic deviation. The kin were portrayed as stunted, primitive beings who had adapted to high-gravity worlds at the cost of their humanity. This portrayal was not merely inaccurate, it was deliberately insulting. The kin were not squats, but representatives of humanity at its finest. They were taller than baseline humans on average, perfectly proportioned, and possessed of intelligence and creativity that surpassed anything the Imperium had produced in millennia. Their abhuman characteristics were not signs of degeneration, but evidence of careful genetic optimization. The truth was that the Imperium couldn't afford to acknowledge the kin as legitimate humans, because doing so would expose the fundamental failures of imperial civilization. While the Imperium had spent 10,000 years in gradual decline, losing technology and knowledge with each passing generation, the kin had continued to advance and improve. When the Leagues of Votann finally revealed themselves to the galaxy at large, the imperial response was predictably violent and irrational. Rather than attempting diplomacy or seeking to learn from kin achievements, the Imperium immediately classified them as a threat to be eliminated. This decision would prove to be one of the greatest strategic mistakes in Imperial history. The Hearthguard elite. When the Leagues of Votann went to war, they did so with the methodical precision that characterized all their endeavors. At the heart of their military forces were the Hearthguard, elite warriors drawn from the most experienced and skilled members of each kindred. These were not mere soldiers, but master craftsmen who had chosen to apply their talents to the art of warfare. Each Hearthguard was equipped with exo-armor that combined the best features of power armor, environmental suits, and mobile weapons platforms. The armor was not mass-produced, but handcrafted by the wearer themselves, incorporating personal modifications and improvements developed over decades of combat experience. No two suits were exactly alike, but all shared certain common features: near invulnerability to small arms fire, integrated weapon systems, and sensor arrays that could track targets through solid matter. The weapons carried by the Hearthguard were equally personalized and devastating: ion weapons that could be reconfigured on the battlefield to deal with different types of enemies, gravitational hammers that could crush tank armor or create localized singularities, energy shields that could deflect incoming fire back at attackers with lethal precision. But the true strength of the Hearthguard lay not in their equipment, but in their training and experience. These warriors had fought in every conceivable environment: the vacuum of space, the crushing depths of ocean trenches, the radioactive hellscapes of bombed-out worlds. They had faced orc wars, tyrannid swarms, and chaos incursions, learning from each encounter and sharing their knowledge with their comrades, tactical doctrine and strategy. Kin military doctrine emphasized flexibility, adaptation, and the efficient application of force. Unlike Imperial forces, which often relied on brute strength and overwhelming our numbers, the Kin preferred surgical strikes and calculated risks. Every battle was planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that went into their mining operations. Intelligence gathering was paramount. Before engaging any enemy, the Kin would deploy reconnaissance forces to study their opponent's capabilities, tactics, and weaknesses. This information would be analyzed by the Votann, who could process vast amounts of data and identify patterns that human minds might miss. Battle plans would be developed that maximized Kin strengths while exploiting enemy vulnerabilities. The Kin were masters of combined arms warfare, coordinating infantry, armor, and air support with precision that made Imperial Guard tactics look primitive. Their vehicles were designed to work together as integrated systems, sharing sensor data and coordinating their attacks through quantum-encrypted communication networks that were virtually impossible to intercept or jam. When possible, the Kin preferred to avoid unnecessary casualties on both sides. They would offer their enemies the opportunity to surrender and would honor truces and parley requests, even in the midst of fierce combat. This wasn't weakness, it was pragmatism. Unnecessary killing was wasteful, and waste was the greatest sin in Kin culture. The Judgment Protocols. Despite their preference for reasonable solutions, the Kin were not pacifists. When faced with enemies who refused to see reason, chaos cultists, tyrannid swarms, or fanatical imperial forces, they would implement what they called the Judgment Protocols. These were systematic procedures for the complete annihilation of threats that couldn't be negotiated with or contained. The Judgment Protocols began with a formal declaration of intent broadcast on all frequencies. The enemy would be informed that they had been judged irredeemably hostile and that their destruction was now inevitable. This wasn't empty boasting. It was a statement of mathematical certainty calculated by the Votann based on complete analysis of the strategic situation. What followed was warfare stripped of mercy or hesitation. Kin forces would coordinate their attacks with clockwork precision, systematically destroying enemy positions, supply lines, and command structures. No quarter would be given, no prisoners taken, no negotiation considered. The enemy would be reduced to component atoms, and their worlds rendered uninhabitable for millennia. The terrifying aspect of the judgment protocols wasn't their brutality, but their efficiency. Enemies targeted for judgment didn't face glorious last stands or heroic sacrifices. They faced methodical extermination, carried out with the same calm professionalism that the kin applied to mining asteroids. First contact renewed. The return of the Leagues of Votann to galactic prominence didn't happen overnight. For centuries, isolated reports had filtered back to imperial authorities. Strange ships with unknown configurations, abandoned mining sites showing impossible levels of technological sophistication, intercepted transmissions in corrupted High Gothic that mentioned names and places not found in any imperial database. These reports were dismissed, classified, or explained away until the evidence became impossible to ignore. The first confirmed contact occurred when an Imperial exploration fleet stumbled across a kin mining operation in the Ghoul Stars. The Imperial ships, expecting to find primitive abhumans or Xenos raiders, instead encountered vessels that were clearly of human origin, but incorporated technologies that shouldn't have existed. The initial exchange was cordial enough. The kin, recognizing the Imperial ships as vessels of their distant cousins, offered greetings and proposed trade agreements. They were genuinely curious about what had become of the Imperium during their long isolation and hoped to re-establish contact with the wider human community. The Imperial response was predictably paranoid and hostile. Rather than reciprocating the kin greeting, the Imperial commander demanded their immediate surrender and submission to Imperial authority. When the kin politely declined, explaining that they had their own government and saw no reason to change it, the Imperials opened fire. The battle was brief and decisive. The Imperial vessels found their weapons ineffective against kin barrier technology, while being systematically dismantled by ion beams and Magna rail cannons. Within minutes, the entire Imperial fleet was either destroyed or disabled. The few survivors were taken aboard kin vessels and treated with a courtesy that they had never shown their hosts. The diplomatic catastrophe. The aftermath of this first contact set the tone for all subsequent relations between the Imperium and the Leagues of Votann. Rather than viewing the encounter as a tragic misunderstanding that could be resolved through negotiation, Imperial authorities saw it as confirmation of their worst fears. Here was a human civilization that could match Imperial technology and was willing to resist Imperial authority. The kin, for their part, were shocked by Imperial hostility and the obvious degradation of human civilization since their departure. The surviving Imperial prisoners told stories of a galaxy consumed by endless war, where entire worlds were sacrificed to maintain a rotting bureaucracy, where knowledge was hoarded by tech priests who treated science like superstition, and where the very mention of innovation was considered heretical. This wasn't the human civilization that the kin had expected to find. They had hoped to discover that their cousins had built something glorious among the stars, a galactic republic based on reason and mutual cooperation. Instead, they found an empire built on fear, ignorance, and the worship of a corpse god who demanded constant sacrifice. Diplomatic overtures from the Leagues were met with suspicion or outright rejection. When kin ambassadors attempted to contact Imperial authorities, they were branded as mutants, traitors, or chaos infiltrators. Their offers of technological exchange were seen as attempts to spread heretical knowledge. Their proposals for mutual defense pacts were interpreted as evidence of seditious conspiracy. The breaking point came when an inquisitor attempted to seize a kin diplomatic vessel and subject its crew to purification rituals. The rescue mission that followed resulted in the complete destruction of an Imperial naval base and the deaths of thousands of Imperial personnel. From that point forward, the Imperium and the Leagues of Votann were effectively at war. The New Great Crusade. The Imperial response to the revealed existence of the Leagues of Votann was swift and predictably violent. Emergency sessions of the High Lords of Terror resulted in the declaration of a new crusade, not to reclaim lost human worlds or defend against Xenos threats, but to destroy the kin before their example could inspire rebellion throughout the Imperium. The stated justification was the usual mixture of religious fanaticism and bureaucratic paranoia. The kin were declared to be mutants who had strayed from the Emperor's light. Their technology was branded as Xenos corruption or chaos sorcery. Their peaceful relations with alien species were cited as evidence of heretical collaboration. The real reason for Imperial hostility was more prosaic, but equally damning. The Leagues of Votann represented everything the Imperium was not: efficient, rational, technologically advanced, and capable of defending themselves without resorting to fanaticism or mass sacrifice. Their very existence undermined the fundamental justifications for Imperial rule. Massive fleets were assembled and dispatched toward the galactic core with orders to locate and destroy all kin settlements. The Adeptus Mechanicus provided experimental weapons designed to overcome kin defensive technology. The Space Marines contributed their finest battle brothers, convinced that they were embarking on a righteous crusade to preserve human purity. What they found waiting for them in the burning heart of the galaxy would shatter their assumptions about human weakness and Imperial supremacy. The core wars begin. The crucible of stars. The galactic core had never been a place for the weak or unprepared. Here, ancient stars burned with fierce intensity, while newer ones were born in spectacular displays of cosmic violence. Gravity wells twisted space-time into impossible geometries, making navigation a constant challenge even for experienced voidfarers. Radiation levels that would kill unprotected humans in seconds were considered merely inconvenient by the kin who had learned to thrive in this hostile environment. When the Imperial Crusade fleets arrived in the outer reaches of kin space, they found themselves operating at the limits of their capabilities. Their ships' Geller fields flickered under the assault of exotic energies. Their navigators reported headaches and strange visions as they tried to plot courses through regions where the laws of physics seemed negotiable. Equipment failed without warning, and even the most experienced crews found themselves struggling with systems that had worked perfectly in normal space. The kin, by contrast, moved through these conditions like fish through water. Their ships were designed specifically for core operations, with shielding systems that could handle radiation, that would fry Imperial vessels, and navigation computers that treated gravitational anomalies as useful landmarks rather than deadly hazards. The first major engagement occurred at the Anvil's Edge, a cluster of resource-rich systems that marked the boundary between kin space and the outer galaxy. Imperial forces expected to face scattered mining installations and lightly defended outposts. Instead, they encountered a coordinated defense network that had been millennia in the making. Kin strongholds emerged from concealment within asteroid belts and stellar coronas, their weapons systems already locked onto Imperial targets. Minefields that operated through dimensional folding made Imperial sensor sweeps useless. And when the shooting started, the Imperials discovered that their enemies were not only technologically superior, but tactically brilliant as well. The hammer of the ancestors. The kin response to Imperial aggression was measured and methodical. Rather than rushing to engage the invaders in desperate battles, they fell back to prepared positions, while their Votann analyzed Imperial tactics, technology, and capabilities. Every skirmish provided data that was instantly shared across the entire League network, allowing kin forces to adapt and counter Imperial strategies with frightening speed. Imperial commanders found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. Flanking maneuvers were met by pre-positioned defensive forces. Supply convoys were ambushed by raiders who knew exactly when and where they would be most vulnerable. Command ships found themselves targeted by weapons that could penetrate their shields and armor as if they were made of paper. The Hearthguard proved particularly effective against Imperial forces. Their exo-armor allowed them to operate in environments that would kill Space Marines, while their weapons could penetrate even Terminator armor with contemptuous ease. More importantly, their experience fighting a wide variety of enemies over thousands of years gave them insights into Imperial weaknesses that even veteran Imperial warriors had never considered. When kin forces went on the offensive, they did so with the systematic precision that characterized all their operations. Imperial positions were studied and analyzed until every weakness was identified and catalogued. Then the attack would begin with surgical strikes against command nodes, communication hubs, and key supply points. By the time Imperial forces realized they were under assault, their ability to coordinate a response had already been eliminated. The Votann Gambit. As the war intensified, the Leagues of Votann revealed capabilities that shocked even their enemies. The Votann themselves began to take a direct role in combat operations. Their vast computational power turned toward the problem of defeating the Imperial invasion. Entire star systems became weapons under Votann control. Solar flares were triggered to disrupt Imperial communications. Asteroid belts were accelerated to create kinetic bombardment systems that could crack planets. Gravitational anomalies were manipulated to trap Imperial fleets in regions of space where time moved differently, aging crews to death while their ships remained frozen in temporal loops. The most devastating Votann strategy was the deployment of what Imperial forces came to call ghost fleets, kin vessels that existed in quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent until the moment they chose to attack. These ships could pass through solid matter, ignore energy weapons, and strike targets that thought themselves safely protected behind shields and armor. Imperial forces found themselves fighting an enemy that could rewrite the laws of physics as needed to achieve victory. Weapons that should have been impossible created casualties that couldn't be explained. Kin warriors appeared in locations that should have been unreachable and disappeared when Imperial reinforcements arrived. The war became a nightmare of impossible events and inexplicable defeats. Imperial desperation. As the core wars dragged on and Imperial casualties mounted, the response from Terra became increasingly desperate. Inquisitors arrived with authority to deploy exterminatus weapons against human worlds, something that went against every principle the Imperium claimed to uphold. Space Marine chapters were ordered to commit their entire strength to what was clearly becoming a war of extermination. The Adeptus Mechanicus began deploying experimental technologies that they had previously considered too dangerous to use. Weapons that could destabilize local space-time, viruses designed to corrupt machine spirits, and devices that attempted to replicate the worst excesses of the Dark Age of technology were all considered acceptable if they could provide an advantage against the kin. Perhaps most tellingly, negotiations were opened with Chaos warbands and Xenos mercenaries who might be willing to fight against the Leagues. The Imperium, which defined itself through its hatred of the alien and the heretic, was prepared to ally with its greatest enemies rather than acknowledge that humanity could exist independently of imperial rule. These desperate measures only served to reinforce kin perceptions of imperial degeneracy. Here was a civilization that would rather destroy itself than admit error, that would embrace chaos rather than change its fundamental assumptions about the nature of human society. The kin revelation? For the Leagues of Votann, the core wars were both a tragedy and an education. They had hoped to find kinship with their imperial cousins, to share the benefits of their advanced technology and peaceful way of life. Instead, they discovered that the Imperium was perhaps the greatest threat to human survival in the galaxy. The kin response was characteristically thorough and systematic. If the Imperium insisted on treating them as enemies, then they would demonstrate what a true enemy of humanity looked like. Kin industrial capacity, previously devoted to mining and exploration, was retooled for war production. Every league committed resources to the common defense, and ancient weapons that had been stored for millennia were brought out of their vaults. Most importantly, the leagues abandoned their traditional isolationism. Diplomatic missions were sent to every major power in the galaxy. Tau, Eldar, even reasonable orc clans, with offers of alliance against the Imperium. If the Imperium wanted to treat the Leagues as just another Xenos threat, then they would find themselves facing a coalition that included the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. The message to the Imperium was clear. The age of human dominance built on ignorance and fanaticism was coming to an end. The galaxy belonged to those who could adapt, innovate, and cooperate, not those who clung to ancient prejudices and outdated dogma. The new galactic order. As the 41st millennium draws to a close, the Leagues of Votann represent something unprecedented in recent galactic history, a human civilization that is growing stronger rather than weaker. While the Imperium struggles with internal divisions, technological decay, and the opening of the Great Rift, the kin continue to expand their territory, improve their technology, and forge new alliances. Their success has not gone unnoticed by other galactic powers. The Tau Empire has expressed interest in technological exchange programs. Several Eldar craft worlds have opened cautious diplomatic channels, recognizing in the kin a human civilization that might actually be capable of learning from past mistakes. Even some orc clans have developed a grudging respect for kin military prowess, leading to the unprecedented sight of honorable conflicts where both sides follow agreed-upon rules of engagement. But perhaps the most significant development is the effect that knowledge of the Leagues has had on imperial worlds themselves. Despite the best efforts of imperial censors, word has spread of a human civilization that prospers without the constant sacrifice demanded by the imperial creed. Rebellions have erupted on dozens of worlds, with rebels claiming they seek to return to the wisdom of the ancestors and establish governments based on reason rather than faith. The Imperium finds itself caught between two equally unacceptable options: acknowledge the legitimacy of the Leagues and risk the collapse of imperial authority, or continue a war that is draining resources needed to fight more existential threats like the Tyranids and Chaos. Every day the conflict continues. The Imperium grows weaker while the Leagues grow stronger. The children of two ages. The Leagues of Votann represent more than just another faction in the grim darkness of the far future. They represent hope. They are proof that humanity's fall from the golden heights of the dark age of technology was not inevitable, that the choice between stagnation and chaos corruption is a false dichotomy imposed by imperial dogma. In the kin, we see what humanity might have become if it had chosen wisdom over power, cooperation over domination, and progress over tradition. They are the children of two ages, inheritors of the Dark Age's greatest achievements and pioneers of technologies that might surpass even those legendary heights. Their story is far from over. The core wars continue to rage, with neither side able to claim decisive victory. The galaxy watches and waits to see whether humanity's future lies with the crumbling edifice of the Imperium or the rising star of the Leagues. But one thing is certain. The kin have changed the fundamental equation of galactic power. They have reminded the universe that humanity, at its best, is capable of greatness. They have shown that the choice is not between order and chaos, but between wisdom and ignorance, between growth and decay, between the courage to build something better and the cowardice to cling to what has already failed. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Leagues of Votann dare to dream of peace. In a galaxy where knowledge is forbidden, they preserve and expand the sum of human understanding. In an age where progress is heresy, they continue to grow and evolve. They are the kin, the forgotten children who remembered their way home, the miners who struck gold in the heart of darkness itself, the ancestors who have returned to show their descendants a better way forward. The future, for the first time in millennia, is not predetermined. The Leagues of Votann have opened a new chapter in humanity's story, and its ending has yet to be written. This concludes our deep dive into the Leagues of Votann, a faction that represents both humanity's greatest achievements and its brightest hopes for the future. In a universe defined by grim-dark despair, they dare to suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, things could be different. Remember to subscribe to the Lore Lord for more deep dives into the rich lore of Warhammer 40,000, and let me know in the comments which faction you'd like to see explored next. The galaxy is vast, and its stories are endless,